Hi, GeriPal listeners. Just want to do a special shout out in the beginning to all of the recent donors to the GeriPal podcast. If you're interested in donating, go to the GeriPal website and just click that big blue button.
Special thank you to Margaret Leung, Huey Lin, Ken Longa, Susan McFadden, Carrie Rubenstein, Marissa Galicia Castillo, Cara Bischoff, Kate Mesrich, James Tulsky, Louise Aronson, Asher Edwards, Mark Apfel, Michael Bordowski, and Meg Walhagen. Thank you very much.
And on with the show. Welcome to the GeriPal podcast. This is Eric Guadera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, we got a full house today. We got somebody in between us, too.
Yeah, we have 3 people in studio. Our listeners will be familiar with Ann Kelly, who's a social worker at the San Francisco VA on the Palliative Care Service, who wrote a JAMA Piece of My Mind titled The Last Visit. Welcome.
Hi, guys. Thank you. Happy to be elbowing my way in between you today.
And also the occasional intro speaker for the GeriPal podcast, so you'll recognize her voice from that.
We also have Liz Salmi, who is a Communications and Patient Initiatives Director at Open Notes at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, and tweets at the Liz Army, where her description is be one, do one, teach one. We'll hear more about that. She's the author of a NEJM perspective titled Deciding on My Dimples. Welcome, Liz, to the GeriPal podcast.
Yay, thanks for having me.
And we're delighted to welcome Preeti Malani, who is professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Disease at the University of Michigan, my alma mater. Woohoo! An ID doc and geriatrician, deputy editor and director of editorial equity at JAMA, and editor of the Piece of My Mind section at JAMA. Welcome to the GeriPal podcast, Preeti.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is going to be part 2 of a series we have on writing. The first one we did with Louise Aronson and Roseanne Leipzig on writing for the lay public. Today we're going to be talking about narrative writing and specifically for healthcare professionals, so in like academic journals and elsewhere. But before we go into that topic, I think, Liz, you got a song request for Alex?
That's right. It's called The Beginning of the End, and it's by Weezer.
Why'd you pick this song?
So I used to be the drummer in a punk rock band.
Get out of here.
No, it's true. And the lyrics to the song, which are by Rivers Cuomo, is the lyricist songwriter for Weezer. I believe what the story is telling is talking about as the front man for a band. He's thinking about what you're thinking right as you're about to go onto a stage and perform in front of this huge audience as with these rock stars. But as in my piece in the New England Journal is about being a patient right before awake brain surgery. And when I was preparing for surgery, that feeling, the nervousness about going live on stage in front of the surgical audience, the lyrics for that became kind of my theme song. And I just had 2 awake surgeries in the last year and a half. And so it's about going live on stage in the medical audience and everything from the whiteboard in the surgery room saying, here's the lineup, who's up next for surgery, and seeing my name on that list of I'm up next, I'm on stage next really spoke to me. And that's how I interpret the lyrics.
That's great. Thank you for that story and for this suggestion. Here we go, without the whole punk rock band and drummer behind me, a little bit of this song. Knocking on my door, they tell me it's time to go on. Last check in the mirror to see if anything's wrong. The writing's up on the wall. A warning shot to them all. My head is spinning. It's the beginning of the end. People freak out when I walk out there so scared. My head is spinning. It's the beginning of the end. People freak out when I walk out there so scared.
Liz, what was your punk rock band's name?
It was called Lucky Strike.
Lucky Strike. Lovely song. I think it's perfect for the topic at hand. And Liz, I'm going to start with you. So you've been dealing with astrocytoma, right? You've had 4 craniotomies.
Right.
You are active on social media, on Twitter. You've kind of written elsewhere. Why did you decide to write this piece for New England Journal's Perspectives? Like, what motivated you to reach out to the healthcare audience in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a person living with a grade 2 astrocytoma for the last 15 years. My entree into healthcare is not in the academic space at all. It's a real lived patient experience. And I started blogging as a patient, just talking about my own story online like patients did back in the day. And then I got online as a patient advocate and started connecting with the brain tumor community on social media and Facebook and Twitter. And actually started working kind of in the healthcare space in palliative care advocacy for a palliative care advocacy organization in California, which is where I'm based, about 8 years ago. And then that transitioned to this world of academic medicine for Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center on the Open Notes Project as both a communication specialist, but also really being passionate about, one of my favorite things is taking complicated concepts and translating it to a lay audience in healthcare as a communicator. And then in the Open Notes work that I do, I was hired to take something complicated like transparency and patients having access to their full records in medicine, and then making that something that the lay public understood. And so in that work, working with Beth Israel in this academic medical center, I was exposed to people who write papers, and I was not trained formally at all in this academic space. But when I'm hanging out with a whole bunch of academics and they're all writing papers, I was like, wait a minute, I could write papers too. Wow, this formula for writing a paper, the intro, the methods, what did we learn, the results, and then what does the big picture say? That type of writing really made sense. It seemed it's a formula essentially. And coming from a communications background, and my form of writing, my formula is, writing for Associated Press style, AP style, and it's a formula. So I was like, wait a minute, there's a formula for academic writing. I could learn this. And so my colleagues and mentors from Open Notes and Beth Israel really supported me in absorbing everything about how to write for academics. And as a patient advocate, was obsessed with wow, patients could do this too. We have stories to tell. How do I, translate that? So in my, fast forwarding to why did I write this specific paper was I, in the last year and a half, have had 2 awake brain surgeries with my wonderful neurosurgeon, Dr. Hervey Jumper at UCSF. And he's a rock star. And having the first surgery about a year and a half ago, I got to experience live, real time, something brand new. Awake surgery, brain surgery, wild. And I learned so much. And I really tried to take notes during that experience. I was like, maybe I'll write a blog post about this later. But it's hard to remember all of that. And am I an unreliable narrator, right? As a person who's writing something during this awake surgery. But because I had a recurrence very quickly within 6 months, I got to go into surgery again. And then I was able to refer to the first surgery just 6 months earlier and think about it going into the surgery. I was like, can I remember everything this time around? What can I learn? I really want to take notes, during surgery. It's very meta. And so going into the surgery, I was laser focused on try to remember everything. I'm going to try to remember as much as I can. So when I wake up, my thought was, I'm going to write a cool blog post about this. And so when I started to kind of write blog posts, a week later coming out of surgery, thinking I just put something out on Twitter and do a Twitter thread, one of my mentors, Dr. Tom Del Banco at the Beth Israel, I said, hey, I'm going to write a Twitter thread about my awake surgery. And he's like, stop. No, this is huge. No, this is bigger than a Twitter thread. what you're telling me is a paper that should be captured in the academic literature somewhere. And so I started going down the rabbit hole of what journal would accept this story and how to frame it and who is the audience. And to me, it's all the clinicians everywhere, and how to write it, how to have it accepted. And so we can go further into that, but really it was to stop and write it for an academic and clinician audience. And to me, it's not just like all the doctors, but also specifically surgeons as well, because they're a different beast. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I can also imagine. So, you writing a traditional academic journal article is one. You said it's formulaic in a way. You have the same sections. Writing this piece for New England Journal Perspectives is much less. Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah. So these perspective pieces are narrative pieces, just like we're going to talk about in a second with the other piece. As a patient, first-person perspective blogger, it made sense to write a perspective first person. Like, I think for most academics, they have a hard time writing first person.
Yeah.
They want to go into third person. The
study showed.
Yeah. And it's really easy as a patient to tell your story first person. But I really wanted to level it up going, wow, if I'm really aiming for the New England Journal, this has to be good. Because then if they see it and they don't like it and reject it, like, okay, I wrote this for this journal, I want to make sure it works for, the backup journals, which were also, cool candidates as well.
Yeah. And hearing that. So Ann Kelly sitting stage left, right? I don't even know what stage means. Anyways, you wrote a piece, JAMA, Piece of My Mind. It's called The Last Visit, about your experience with your mom and the last visit that you had with her. I'm wondering, hearing Liz's story about how things came to fruition with her New England Journal piece, did any of that resonate with you?
I had a very different path toward this process. So my piece is really sort of reflections around caring for my mom, who died sort of toward the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, and the influence of my work in hospice and palliative care, and sort of the perspective that I brought to my care for her in that time. And since my mom died in 2020, until I wrote this piece in the fall of last year, I had not ever expected or intended to write about my experience. I'm not a writer, I would say, and I'm not someone who journals or does other writing activities. And so, and as I went through my grief process, journaling and writing was not something I did. It was something I heard could be a good idea, but I really just had no words over time. And so it was really in the fall of this last year that, for no good, real, logical reason, I just felt myself suddenly feeling compelled to write. And there was a moment in time where I kind of indulged the feeling. And so I just let whatever that was, these words that were coming to my mind, I kind of just let myself put them to paper and to see what happened. And honestly, I thought it was going to end up just being sort of a vent session on a piece of paper. But what came out was something different. And I was sort of struck by that. And I sort of it was private, and it was something I worked on privately over time. And then as it took shape and to closer to what it is now, I kind of took a step back and looked at it and just sort of felt like, what is this? I don't know what this is. It feels special to me. It feels important to me. Is it something that just lives in a binder and under a bunch of papers in my desk somewhere, or is this something different than that? And so that's when I actually took it to Alex, here sitting on my left, to sort of say, I don't know what this is. Help me figure it out. And that's really what prompted me to work toward considering sharing it in this way.
Thank you for that story. And yeah, I think, there's one thing writing for yourself, and there's another writing it for a potentially very large audience that probably the sense of vulnerability, and
Scared to go on is the lyric in the song. Yeah.
did you feel that way too?
Yes, it was scary even just to share it with Alex, and a few other very sort of trusted people that are very close to me. And it was very emotional for me to write it and to reread it. And so it was incredibly, it just brought with it a lot of vulnerability for me personally. And so when he suggested, hey, there could be something here. Eventually, I also brought Eric into the conversation to sort of say, what do you think? And they both were saying, go for it. But it actually took me, I think, maybe 2 months sort of just sitting on it and really thinking about it and really thinking about why would I put it out there? For who? For what reason? And if I did want to, do I have the courage to do it?
Can I ask, why did you put it out there? For what reason?
That's something I'm still figuring out, if I'm honest with you. I think ultimately it was, I really trust the people around me, and the people around me were telling me that this could resonate with other people's experience, that it's sort of finding words that other people relate to, and that for other people, it might resonate with them or feel good to read something like what I wrote.
Yeah.
And in the end, I kind of believed you. I decided to believe the people I trusted around me, that maybe this could be helpful to someone else, although I went into it reluctantly, not sure.
Yeah. And Liz, for you, why did you write yours? You said for the surgeons. Is it?
Well, no. I mean, it's interesting what you're saying. You're like, I was encouraged. You're encouraged by colleagues or mentors. Hey, this is good. I have a story here, and that resonates with me. That a colleague said, your blog posts could be bigger than you could put this somewhere to reach a specific audience. And so I had a mentor who was like, clean that up, and make it, that this could go somewhere big like JAMA or New England Journal. And so then to me, then it became a challenge, like a mission of, what is it I want to say? And you talked about, being a little nervous about, there's a vulnerability of putting that out there. And I realized a little bit later in writing my story about awake surgery is that, I recognize that it's a unique experience. Not many even brain neurosurgery patients get to be awake. Not many people with malignant brain tumors who've gone through awake surgery are able to tell these stories. Like, people die. And I felt like there's a little bit of a duty of being a person who could deliver the message about the experience when many others cannot. So there's this like almost higher purpose of representing this perspective. But then being nervous about, am I going to be smart enough to put this in the New England Journal? Do I have the right way of explaining this? And then in submitting the manuscript, I also realized there are two characters in my paper. It's first person Liz, who's going through brain surgery, and then there's the protagonist is my neurosurgeon, Sean, who I was like, oh my gosh. I messaged him as like, I'm going to write about awake surgery and I'm going to submit it to a journal. He's like, you go. And then I was like, a couple months later, I'm like, I think it might be accepted by a big journal, which means more people will see it. Did you know that this, I just want you to know, and he's like, you go, I'm excited for you. And then it got accepted. And I was like, so just so you know, it's the New England Journal and people are going to hear about, our surgical experience together. And he was overjoyed and excited. But then when I kind of dug into it a little bit further, I was like, well, I just want to make sure you feel comfortable that this isn't just about you, me, it's also about you. And so I kind of really wanted to share. So there's the vulnerability of realizing I'm telling somebody else's story. And I want to make sure I'm representing him well in a way isn't feeling too exposed, if that makes sense.
And Preeti, I'd love to get your perspective. So we're starting off with a question of
Yeah.
Why? Why do this? And we've heard a couple of reasons why both Anne and Liz did it. You get, I'm guessing, a ton of narrative medicine essays, perspectives. But even taking a step back, why does JAMA even have this section, this piece of my mind section in it?
Thanks for the question, Eric. And before I forget, so Liz, Sean was at Michigan for years.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah.
And just a lovely, lovely person, amazing surgeon. So I kind of smiled when you mentioned that. And I know we'll talk a little bit about Anne's piece in a moment, but Eric, the section in JAMA has actually been there since 1980, if you can believe it. So, and it looks very, very different today than it did then. But some things haven't changed much. And in fact, at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, we were planning on doing this theme issue, 40 years of A Piece of My Mind, and that actually was published in early May of 2020. And you can imagine that the planning period was different than the time right before it went up. And we picked 40 essays from the past 10 years to highlight, and it is there's a subjectivity to it. Which is difficult. Why write? To me, I think at a very basic level, so much about medicine is dehumanizing, and ultimately, there's this human aspect that's there. There's this beauty that's there. Whether we're doing geriatrics, infectious disease, palliative care, it's really about people. And so much in medicine, especially the health records, the EHR, is so not about people and not about the clinicians that deal with the records either. And yet, how do you bring that forth? And I feel like narrative and storytelling does that. One difference with the JAMA section that I think trips up some people is that we require written permission from everyone. And Anne, I'm sure we probably required your dad or somebody to sign something. And, Liz, you mentioned Sean, like you took the opportunity to tell him. We would have required probably a signature. And it's sort of amazing that ends up being a roadblock sometimes, because people are writing things that are so deeply personal. And for a variety of reasons, JAMA has this very high bar around this permission piece. But that's a little bit of an aside. Eric, you mentioned it's very selective. About 1,000 plus essays and 48 a year are accepted. And so they're good ones that get passed on. And I think it's very difficult because people are vulnerable. They are coming to you often with something very, very deeply personal. And I've never submitted a piece of my mind. I'm not sure I could write one, to be honest. I found one as I was cleaning up my office. I found something I'd written in 2016. And I think maybe I had that on my, that on my radar that I would like to write about something for a piece of my mind. And it's funny, I just kind of tucked it aside. I might get back to it and try to maybe send it to New England Journal's Perspectives. But it is, my point is that these are beautifully written, most of them. The writing itself is captivating, but it's the story also. And something that I look for is, novelty, sort of a compelling story, but also, is there something actionable? Because, like, for example, we get a lot of pieces on wellness and mental health, and there are a lot of, like, for example, and not to criticize medical students, but sometimes you get an M1 or M2 writing about burnout in physicians. And, sometimes I'm like, okay, that's a harder piece to write about. It's almost like you're an outsider looking in versus one of my favorite essays. It's called Beyond Burnout. And maybe we can share that in the notes. Mm-hmm. And it's such a gripping piece. But, Anne's piece, and if I may, I just want to read the intro. And I hope that's okay.
Sure.
Might be easier for me to read it. The last visit. I love you to pieces. My mom said this to me 2 nights before she died. She was sitting upright in her recliner chair, the only place where she could find temporary moments of comfort. It was late at night. The house was dark and she couldn't sleep. The sensation of itching pins and needles haunted her right cheek from the shingles she had months earlier. Her back hurt, her hips ached, and her feet, riddled with bandages, hung carefully over the edge of the footrest. She looked at me lying on the couch near her and whispered the words. You read that and you want to keep reading. And it's like this subjective thing. If you look at the first paragraph or the first sentences of these pieces, often there is something like that. And, it's like this hook that draws you in. And of course, Anne's piece, I hope everyone has read it. If you haven't, it's such a moving piece. So it's a love story. It's a story about caregiving. It's a story about how extraordinarily difficult the pandemic was, not just because of COVID, but because of everything else. Thank you, Anne, for writing it, because, people read that and that dehumanization is pushed away because it's such a human story.
Thank you.
Let me ask you this. Is it actionable? You mentioned actionable. Is it actionable? Yeah. And what actions are we looking for?
Yeah. And again, I think not everything is actionable, but I'm going to give you a few examples. Again, the well-being pieces, the parenting. There's a lot of pieces on parenting. And there are a lot of pieces on, and everything from young kids to older kids to adult children. That caregiving piece, like I want to see something actionable. And sometimes it might be like, hey, if you see microaggressions, step up and say something. Yeah. I wish that this person had said something. There's a great piece written by a physician who describes a racial microaggression. And I think she was a student at the time or a resident, and a patient said something to her, and that her team didn't really at that moment step up and say, no, this is not acceptable. And I think that's what I'm talking about with action. Or it might be family leave policies. It might be everyone should eat lunch together with other people. And so I'm not looking just for like a line listing of policy points, but something that you can take away. But the novelty is important.
So here's something that I take away, and this may be because I know Anne so well, but from her piece, one of the key aspects from my perspective in reading it is that, here we have a, hospice and palliative care social worker, deeply committed to the field, deeply committed to improving quality of life for people near the end of life. Seen, as you wrote in that piece, many patients walk this journey, and concerned about people who are nearing the end of life, who end up in the intensive care unit and dying with care that is potentially burdensome to them, with little chance of meaningful quality of life. And you introduced the piece talking about how you were there with your mother 2 days before she died. She's not in hospice, and you're talking about admitting her to the hospital. And so that, how can this be? How can this be somebody who's so deeply invested and embedded in hospice and palliative care, caregiver for her mother, and is at this point where she's talking about like highly aggressive life-prolonging treatment? Like, what happened here? And so the take home for me was that, God, these things are complicated. And they don't always work out the way that you would think they might work out. And we have these quality metrics like hospitalization days before death, used hospice, enrolled in hospice in days before death. And they're limited. They are limited because on the individual level, when you get down to it, the complexities of these stories and the caring involved may lead to these complex relationships, understanding what the goals are, as you had done with your mom. And you said, she wanted this, but not yet.
Yeah, I think, as folks will learn from reading my essay, is my mom was someone who she had multiple medical problems, including end-stage kidney disease, and had been on dialysis for a number of years. And by that point, her health had declined such that we knew, doctors had warned us that we were getting to a new place, that soon there would come a time where dialysis would no longer be possible. And so we had begun bracing ourselves for that and imagining that, of course, when that time comes, hospice will be the service that would be best to support her and us and keeping her comfortable at home. And we weren't there yet. We still wanted more time together and hoped that, with certain interventions that we might be able to buy more time together. And it's really sort of sitting in that crossroads that we found ourselves in that day. And of course, something unexpected happened the next day that we couldn't have predicted or foreseen. But yes, it was a constant tension around when is the right time, and sort of living with that.
And it's also interesting because when you read these pieces, and I love Peace of Mind. Is it one of the most read parts of JAMA?
Yes. And it's like 1,000 words that can transform you.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's like such a short piece.
And people read into it what they read into it. So for example, Alex, that was the thing for him. The first time I read it, I immediately thought, oh, you got to submit this to JAMA. And part of it was exceptionally timely. The fact that we were talking about the COVID was woven into it, in particular, isolation, limited access, worrying about transmitting a fatal virus to somebody, this tension that builds up, not being able to visit in hospital settings. It just felt like everything is right here. And it's so important to get this message out about just the trauma that kind of we all went through, not just COVID trauma, but all the things that came along with it. And it just felt very timely. And I wonder from your perspective, Preeti, how important is the timeliness? Like it's the topic. Like wellness comes up a lot, but kind of feels like, that was something that we talked a lot about, 4 years ago. And we're kind of thinking a lot more about wellness in different ways now than, doctors should be mindful.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's been a very interesting sort of tracking the pandemic, and the story of the pandemic is ultimately going to be told in narrative form. It isn't the randomized trials, which are very important, obviously, for the work that all of us do, that work that I do clinically. Anne's piece was a little bit different in that she wrote it later, and you explained, Anne, that this was part of your grief process, and you weren't sitting out to write an essay about this experience. This was something you're a grieving daughter, and also trying to manage probably a lot of other things during the pandemic. And again, your mom didn't die from COVID.
Right.
But it was during a time where we were very worried about this. And if I can share, in my own family, my grandmother died early in the pandemic. She was just before her 97th birthday. And my brother and I are both infectious disease physicians, and we live near where we grew up. And my grandmother lived with my parents. And this was in May of 2020. We get that phone call that we'd been dreading for a while. And my grandmother is actually doing quite well overall, but had been declining. And a lot of it, I think, was just social. It just wasn't interested in things as much. And the discussion that we had was, what are we going to do? She really should go to the hospital, but it's May 2020. It means no one's going to be able to go in there with her. And she couldn't hear. She didn't speak English very well. And my brother ended up driving her to his hospital because he said, at least I can be with her. What kind of decision, what kind of world do we live in where that's the kind of decisions we had to make? And I got that sense, it reminded me of the situation my family had to kind of figure out also. And millions of families had to figure these things out. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, I think that we have forgotten some of this, but those early days were just, COVID wasn't the only risk. Yeah. It was one of 20 risks that we thought about.
When I hear each of you talking, and Liz, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this too. It reminds me around how, so I kind of put myself out there, right? I didn't really know what to expect. And actually what I learned is exactly what you guys are illustrating, which is the people for whom my essay sort of resonated, it resonated for them in different ways and for different reasons. And some people so kindly sent me messages, and, some people, it resonated with them around having a deeper sense of empathy for what their patients and their families are going through. For others, it reminded them of the experiences they've had in caring for someone that they love in their family. And so different pieces of it resonated with people differently. And I'm wondering, Liz, if that's been your experience also in the kind of feedback you've received.
Yeah. Thank you for asking me that. It was very social worker of you to bring me in to the conversation and asking that question. Yeah. It's my essay was not like a timely thing. There was no like tie into the moment of COVID. And it was, I'm a empowered patient advocate individual, and I feel like there were the emotions, the feels were not necessarily in my message, my essay at all. I think for me writing it, there was like a little bit of to me, it was, this is neat. I'm really curious about the experience. Like, I learned something here, and I want people to understand what it was like to be in this moment, because it's so rare. But the responses, I was excited that it got accepted. I couldn't believe that happened. And I want to get back to you, Preeti. You said, if this was, I'm surprised the New England Journal didn't ask for like some sort of disclosure, or they did. They confirmed, and we worked with Sean, who's like, you guys go. So we were good there too. But I think what the community, the response, what that was overwhelming. You don't need to be a neurosurgeon and have had that surgery experience. It was all the folks what people were excited about was the concept of shared decision making. That was what we're demonstrating in that surgical situation. Shared decision making during surgery at the same time, which then adds that novelty component. Is wow, how do you do that? And Sean is demonstrating, like in a rock star way, how do you do shared decision making in that moment? And in talking later with Sean, I was like, so did you hear from anyone like in neurosurgery, like what they thought? And he's like, oh my gosh, dude, like, yes. And we had two completely different experiences. I had like the palliative care, medical Twitter communities, like shared decision-making, way to go, Liz. And then Sean's response, from what I'm learning, is neurosurgery was not talking to me because they don't know me, but neurosurgery was going to Sean saying, your patient wrote about you in the New England Journal. And you do this, you ask patients live during surgery, like, what choice do you want to make? That's radical. And so I believe he's having to defend a little bit about this new way that neurosurgery is performed, where we're not just making these decisions just at that moment in time. There's many discussions about my quality of life, what is meaningful to me. I'm like, it's all about running and movement. And if my foot drop is, happening, I understand that, but I still want to move. So we had all these pre-planning discussions before surgery. So he knew what my goals were in that moment. He could say, do we stop or do we keep going?
And I think that's the interesting thing too. It's going to what Preeti said. It's both novel and it is very timely. It's something. There's a growing movement around this, and not just like traditional shared decision making, but shared decision making in a way that really I haven't seen talked about before.
Right. Very extreme. Yeah.
So let me ask you, Liz. This is that why a medical journal? Like you talk about, you could do a tutorial, you get some number of people. You can get a New England Journal and you get thousands more. Yeah. You get in the New York Times, you get millions more. Why this avenue?
Who's the audience? Who are you writing for? As a patient advocate, like I mentioned, how I got into this space, writing to my fellow patient community, writing for fellow patient audiences, writing from an advocacy perspective for the brain tumor community, or like this emerging patients as researchers and collaborators in the design and conduct of research community. Like that is the growing and existing. And I was just so moved from this experience of, I don't know, this at the end, I don't have someone to recap or read my essay, but at the end, I talk about the last paragraph, or the last paragraph says, with surgery in our rear view mirrors, the decisions we made and we shared are behind us, and our paths as surgeon and patient now diverge. But my curiosity is piqued, and I suspect my next research collaboration will be inspired by my time in the operating room. Once you've traveled to the moon, the Earth never looks the same as again. Mm-hmm. And it was just like, to me, it was like the peak of advocating for myself, understanding my needs, partnering with my clinician, my doctor, my surgeon, to make decisions that are life-changing. And I am just inspired by the partnership that we had. And so, I sometimes people talk about brain surgery, rocket science, because as like this kind of joke. And I was thinking about how there's this almost outer space experience you have in that situation. And there was the best way I could communicate some situation that other people will probably never have was to compare it to being like out in outer space. I almost did this whole like analogy, one of the great things these editors do is they're like, bring it down, like too many words. And I was like, I really wanted to talk about like, I'm this astronaut who's out in space traveling the moon, but then the neurosurgeons there, like their mission control in Houston, guiding you through this process. I wish there was a little more words for it, but hopefully me sharing it here on the podcast will be my space to do that.
Well, let me ask another question, because this is really about narrative writing, the components of it, the process of getting it into a journal. We talked about this in our last podcast around the lay public is working with editors. Is there a tension between once you're in that process, you get people giving you feedback about losing your own voice, why you wrote it for yourself, and now incorporating other people's voices into your narrative? Like they're giving you feedback to change certain aspects, to narrow it down, maybe change words. Do you worry about losing your own voice? I'm going to start with Anne. Thoughts on that?
I think for me, the biggest editing came from having to meet the 1,600 word limit for Piece of My Mind. And so I did a lot of editing and whittling down prior to submitting. And then once it was accepted, after I picked my jaw up off the floor in shock that it was accepted, we went through the editing process. And I would say in my experience, there was very few things that had to be tweaked. It was really around adjusting a few word choices here and there just to be in keeping with the words that people are sort of using currently. So for example, in my essay, I initially used the phrase emergency room, and JAMA said we use emergency department, so very minimal kind of changes. So I was lucky in that I didn't have to sort of be challenged in that way.
Yeah. Well, I can't pull up one thing, and we'll see if Preeti yells at me for this. There were some word choices that you disagreed with, right? That you also pushed back on?
There were a couple.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, I mean the editor or the copyright editor initially, like I used the phrase, I checked my mom's blood sugar, and the copyright editor just sort of automatically changed it to I checked my mom's blood glucose, which is nothing I would ever say in real life. And so when I noticed that, I asked permission to learn more about whether it would be really required to use the word glucose or if I could keep blood sugar in there, which would be more in keeping with my natural communication style. And in the end, they gave it to me.
And Preeti, how do you think about that too?
Yeah. So what would have happened is I would have, I get the essays, I would have done the first pass, and, the piece was really nicely written when it came in, as I recall. It was several months ago now, so I don't remember the details, but I suspect, it's things like time and, precision of language. But then you're right, when it goes to the manuscript editor, sometimes those things, they get like doctor gets changed to physician. And sometimes I'm like, no, doctor is okay. Sometimes you want to say doctor. And there's flexibility. And I think blood sugar, I'm glad we allowed that. They probably asked me and I would have said, no, definitely in this section, use it. You wouldn't use it in a randomized trial, but
Right.
So it's okay to push back a little bit if you think something's important.
a little bit. And, I would say, just quickly, I know we're wrapping up here, is that I try to preserve the writer's voice,
Yeah.
but, making sure some things are clear. The precision of the language isn't always there. Sometimes there's just like missing pieces or things need to be reorganized a bit. But these are not heavily edited essays.
Yeah.
I mean, they're edited. Anything that needs that much editing wouldn't probably make it.
Yeah.
So you want to see something, it's got a great idea, and then it's a matter of polishing, I would say, more than hardcore editing.
And Liz, from your perspective, did you ever worry about losing your voice, or did it feel like you were able to keep it the whole time?
It felt like me the whole time. I'd say from editors, I mean, their job, I felt like any edits and tweaks I got were great. They're minor. And then I think the really valuable thing the editor asked me was to say, hey, I noticed this entire essay, you're referring to your neurosurgeon by his first name. I introduce him as Dr. Sean Hervey Jumper. This is his title. But then for the rest of the paper, you talked about him as Sean, first person, as opposed to Dr. Hervey Jumper. And, that's a choice. Do you want to make that choice? And to check with me. And I said, I thought about it. I was like, oh my gosh, am I minimizing Sean's expertise and experience by referring to him in this way throughout this whole thing? So I did text him and I said, I just got the paper accepted. We're going through review. Are you okay with this? And mainly my decision to say that was that when my first time meeting him as this is going to be your neurosurgeon to remove your malignant brain tumor, he came into the room, first time meeting, and said, hey, I'm Sean. And we shook hands. And to me, he's been Sean ever since. And so that's how I see him. And that's the way he talks during surgery. And so I wanted to maintain that and wanted the audience to recognize, like, this is his personality throughout. And from what I've learned, later, he's like, I want to make sure you feel comfortable talking to me because we're going to be doing a ton of communication during surgery, live, real time. And if you want me to refer to you as Liz and you want me to refer to you, be referred to as Sean, then we're going to do that. And so having that established situation about how we communicate with each other was key. So the editor, wanted to make sure that was okay with both sides, and it was.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I think Preeti actually has to leave right now, so feel free to leave. But we're going to end with Alex singing a little bit more of that song.
Preeti.
Thank you.
Preeti.
Thanks. Bye.
Alex, as Preeti goes off, a little bit more Weezer.
Nostradamus predicted a bomb would drop, and all of our guitars would be hung in an old pawn shop. Watch us brush off the dust, in heavy metal we trust. My head is spinning, it's the beginning of the end. People freak out when I walk out, they're so scared. My head is spinning, it's the beginning of the end. People freak out when I walk out, they're so scared.
Liz, Ann, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for the song.
And thanks for putting your words out there. They're really impactful, obviously in different ways to different people. So very much appreciate it. And thank you all of our listeners for supporting the GeriPal podcast. And a special shout out to the individuals who've donated more than $250 over the last year.
Including Harry Hahn, Elizabeth Chung, Kathy Foley, Rochelle Bernacki, Lloyd Woolstat, Christine Ritchie, Matthew Schuster, Daryl Owens, Susan Nelson, Christopher Heck, Lindsay Yorman, Mo Rezawi, Sue Borson, Carrie Rubenstein, Marissa Galicia Castillo, Cara Bischoff, Kate Mesrich, James Tulski, Louise Aronson, Asher Edwards, Mark Apfel, Michael Bordowski, and Meg Walhagen. Thank you very much.